Welcome, fellow historical weirdos, to the super short audio thing that I slap onto the start of all my episodes. I'm recording this one during the last months of 2023, and Season 2 is officially underway! Season 2 promises to be just as commercial-free as Season 1, which means that if you want to support this show's continued existence, please consider becoming a patron of Past Peculiarity in exchange for a teeny monthly fee. Doing so will earn you your very own certified historical weirdo plastic medallion. Designed and 3D printed right here in the USA in an actual historian's living room, these medallions are collector's items and are shaped like actual circles. Run a pencil around the edge and draw as many chariot wheels, top-down views of grain silos, closed-mouth Pac-Mans, or outside of yin-yangs as you'd like. And they come with an actual paper certificate with your actual name on it. Go to findyourselfinhistory.com/sponsors to learn more. Subscriptions can be canceled at any time, but medallion and certificate are yours for life and to bequeath to future generations of confused descendants. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back to this mind-opening, mind-blowing, eye-opening, eye-blowing new podcast about how genuine, evidence-derived history helps you to better fathom the strangeness of now. So hey there, listener. Even if you get nothing else out of this podcast, I hope that you retain the following important idea. History is big. A lot happened in the past, and we're still discovering and rediscovering the past when we analyze readings and other artifacts left behind from eras gone by. And history isn't only about happenings either. It's also about understanding what made past societies tick, their values, their institutions, their motivations, their priorities. Real history is about trying to make sense of the cultural contexts of past peoples in all their bigness over space and time. Past peoples constitute an enormous group of folks from an enormous diversity of backgrounds over pretty much the whole globe, over thousands of years. And because they experienced and thought and valued different things than us, they're often more different from us than folks generally expect them to be. The academic discipline of history shows us that the human condition is far bigger and more complicated and messier and weirder than it seems when you think only in the here and now. And that's why I'm sometimes cheesed off when I hear folks try to talk about the past as if it's small and or simple. Take, for example, many different media that claim to bring you simple, digestible advice from the annals of history about leadership. There are abundant examples out there of so-called historical advice that remove certain leaders from their actual historical contexts. Go to your favorite search engine and type in the name of almost any historical king, emperor, president, prime minister, inventor, philosopher, coach, artist, or writer that you can possibly think of, along with the words leadership advice, and you'll almost certainly see what I mean. The sites that pop up make these leaders out to be folks who are just like you and me, except it's like Joan of Arc and Aristotle and Genghis Khan are giving some kind of management seminar in the convention center at your nearby Hilton Diet Hotel, where for the low price of just $799 you can sit down on poorly padded stackable chairs and hear long-dead folks talk you through their PowerPoint presentations. For the most part, though, leaders of the past hailed from strikingly different worlds than ours. So today, let's explore what kinds of advice the leaders from yesteryear really have to offer us. As you'll soon see, some of their advice might seem so off-putting that it'll make you want to get up from your aforementioned poorly padded stackable chair and leave the convention hall entirely and storm off to the hotel restaurant and drown your sorrows with a double nachos deluxe platter. But I promise it's going to turn out okay. I'm a professional historian, and I've been trained to guide you through unconventional situations just like this one. My name is Doug Sofer, and I'm a weirdo, just like you. tell everyone you know about this podcast and make sure to check out findyourselfinhistory.com/sponsors if you'd like to support this show. Thank you. Sure, it's possible to pick and choose tidbits of leadership advice from the past in order to make it seem coherent and relevant to the present. More often than not, though, the wise counsel of past powerful people seems today as if it came from some other dimension. Similarly, today's guidance on governance would seem equally alien to yesterday's elite. And you are a weirdo is literally the name of this podcast, so this is the correct place for us to consider these issues. Today's episode is called You Ask Leading Questions. Quick caveat before we begin. Toward the end of this episode, we discuss a few especially ugly truths about historical leadership strategies. If you've got young'uns around, you should know that this episode gets a bit uglier than usual with the final two parts. Those two parts are Lesson 2 and Lesson 1. Why, you might ask, are we counting down numbered lessons today? Because in typical leadership seminar fashion, we are going to present our information in the format of an easily digestible list that we'll call 5 Questionable Bits of Leadership Advice from History. Let's get to it. Lesson 5. Dress for success by preventing others from wearing nice things. The advice often goes that you should dress for the job you want. But what if someone else wants your job? When that happens, just do what the savvy leaders in 13th century Burgundy did. Place legal restrictions on the length of ordinary people's shoes. Yes, that's correct. In the Burgundy region of central France, the points on commoners' shoes were only allowed to be a maximum of 6 inches long. But the Burgundian prince could have 24-inch shoe points. You just need to pass a similar law, and you've solved your problem. And why stop there? Now that you've got your mega pointy shoes, why not also dress like a weasel? You too could dazzle your friends and humble your enemies by wearing ermine fur. An ermine is a kind of weasel, also called a stoat. And in the winter, these guys' fur turns white and becomes especially soft. The bad news for stoats was that nobles coveted these weasels' winter coats, and would therefore convert these animals into prestigious clothing. Royal robes could be made almost entirely of ermine fur. Other nobles and fancy people had fur trim on their clothing, like for the robes of English lords, and even for academic regalia of scholars at Oxford and Cambridge in England. It's what the black spotted white fur part is made of that goes around the imperial state crown. The good news for ermines, though, was that for much of European history, stoat fur was not legally allowed to be used by common folk. So whether we're talking about shoe points or weasels, governments throughout much of the history of the world passed what are called sumptuary laws. Laws that restrict which official categories of humans are permitted to purchase certain kinds of personal consumer goods, like food, or jewelry, or clothing. Which governments had sumptuary laws? A whole bunch of them, all around the world. In Europe alone, these kinds of sumptuary laws about ermine fur ranged all the way from Spain in the west to Turkey in the east, pretty much the whole length of Europe. So, for instance, there's this series of laws from Valladolid in the Spanish kingdom of Castile that dates all the way back to 1283. It begins with a statement that the king can wear whatever he wants, and then it continues. No grandee, knight, or any other man whomsoever may have more than 4 suits of clothing each year, and those may not bear ermine, drawn work, silk, gold, or silver thread, elaborate needlework, gold embroidery, pelts, trimmings, or any regal or elaborate material whatever except fur and cloth. 1 suit of clothing may not be covered with another. No one except the king may wear a scarlet rain cloak. This section keeps going for a while, and eventually concludes, no one may wear marten furs except the king, a noble, a grandee, or a bridegroom if he is the son of a grandee. No one may wear silver, crystal, buttons, long chains, ermine, or otter on their cloaks or robes except around the edges of their mantle. For the record, a marten is yet another kind of weasel. In 1727, 4 centuries later, on the opposite side of the continent, in Turkey, then called the Ottoman Empire, that government created a similar sumptuary law. It also prohibited non-elite men and women from wearing ermine fur. And from the many centuries between the Middle Ages through the 18th century and beyond, many different kingdoms all over Europe created similar weasel-based sumptuary laws. To sum up lesson number 5, then, great European leaders dug stoat fur, and they were not weirdos. Unlike you. Why does that sentence sound familiar? Anyway, if you want to learn more, a book of essays about sumptuary laws in world history called A Right to Dress came out just a couple of years ago. I'll put a full citation up on findyourselfinhistory.com if you're interested. For now, let's move on to our next bit of timeless leadership advice. Lesson 4. Obey, but don't comply. The Spanish Empire ruled over much of the land and most of the people of the American hemisphere for approximately 3 centuries. Starting in the decades after Columbus did his ocean blue sailing thing in 1492, and all the way through the end of the 1820s, Spain controlled an enormous territory whose borders went further north than the Great Salt Lake in what is today the U.S. state of Utah, and as far south as Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America. What's more, this European kingdom exerted control over a territory that incredibly vast from across the ocean. And they pulled off this feat prior to the existence of any kind of instantaneous communication, like the telegraph, which I talk about in episode 5. Surely an empire as huge and long-lasting as that of colonial Spain must have some great lessons for managers and leaders today, right? Let's find out. There were many keys to Spain's New World success, but one of those keys has to do with the way that the kingdom organized its overseas colonial government. At the top of the metaphorical pyramid of this kingdom was, perhaps not surprisingly, the monarch. For most of Spanish history, that meant the king. Next was an elite group of high-profile advisors called the Council of the Indies, a group that was supposed to know as much as anyone about the American hemisphere and how to extract as much out of those colonies as possible. Both the monarch and the Council of the Indies were located in Spain. Meanwhile, the top Spanish officials who were actually physically located across the Atlantic in the Americas were called viceroys. Viceroy pretty much means vice-king, the same way that the prefix vice works in vice-president. Spain's kingdom was an absolute monarchy, somewhat like the French iteration of absolutism that we talked about in the previous episode. Like in France, the Spanish king was the living embodiment of Spain itself, appointed by God to rule. In other words, according to the working theory of government operating at the time, all authority in the Spanish Empire came in theory from God in heaven. That authority then traveled to the monarch, who then relayed God's power to the Council of the Indies, who sent it across the ocean to the viceroy, and eventually through the rest of the pyramid of government, one rank at a time. In other words, there's only one real rule of absolute monarchy. The monarchy's authority comes from God and therefore must be obeyed in all cases, under all circumstances. Except that sometimes the monarch didn't really know what was happening in his American colonies, because they were across the ocean. And the monarch's advisors in the Council of the Indies were also across the ocean. Okay, so you're the viceroy. What do you do if you receive an order from the God-appointed king by way of the Council of the Indies, and that order doesn't seem to make any sense? For instance, some orders may be out of date by the time they arrive, because the situation in the Americas has changed since the written orders were first dispatched, from across the ocean, in a sailing ship that could take many months to reach you. In those cases, the Spanish management system had a neat built-in legal trick that they could pull. The viceroy in this case could reply to specific orders with the following powerful sentence: Obedezco, pero no cumplo, which means, I obey, but I will not comply with this specific order. This sentence wasn't just a saying. It was a specially worded, legally justified objection that dated back to the Middle Ages. When invoked, it works like this. The viceroy takes orders from the king because he can't possibly question orders that came from the Council of the Indies, which was obeying the king, who was obeying God. So not obeying was out of the question. But complying with orders did not always make sense either. So you could obey. That is, indicate your eternal adherence to the Spanish monarch as the embodiment of the divine will. But you could also not comply, because your specific orders didn't make any sense. Because they came from across the ocean. It might seem that obeying without complying was a kind of improvised response to an overly rigid system, but it was more than that. In fact, the Spanish system was deliberately held together through encouraging complete obedience to the religiously justified system on one hand, while recognizing that government officials, especially high-ranking ones, had to use their own judgment in order to evaluate their orders on the other hand. In his 2004 book called The King's Living Image, historian Alejandro Cañeque explains how Spanish theorists of government understood this seemingly paradoxical concept of leadership, and why it wasn't contradictory at all in their eyes. Cañeque explains, "The Spanish monarchy never abandoned the notion that the main reason that justified the existence of kings was their obligation to administer justice. Spanish political thinkers continued to see the king as a judge, and in particular as a reflection of God's justice. In other words, as God's appointed servant, a king's job was literally to make judgment calls, to do justice on earth. And that same responsibility to make judgments and to administer justice to the best of one's ability fell also to officials in the king's government." Citing an important 17th century Spanish political theorist, Cañeque makes clear that officials of the monarch were never supposed to obey an order blindly if that official genuinely believed that it would have harmful, unjust results. "For that reason, I obey, but will not execute the order," makes perfect sense within this specific historical context. And it's probably pretty solid political advice all around for anyone working for an ocean-spanning empire when you're obeying an absolute monarch who is appointed directly by God to rule. Which brings us to our next piece of advice. Lesson number 3. Share your bathwater. This leadership wisdom comes through examining another long-lasting dynasty. In this case from 19th century Indonesia, in the central region called Blora on the island of Java. Java is the most populated island out of the 17,000 plus islands that make up the modern-day country of Indonesia. Adrian Vickers, a professor of Southeast Asian studies, talks about one such ruler in the 19th century named Hamengkubuwono VII, whose moniker means, "he who holds the world in his lap." Hamengkubuwono VII was the sultan of the mostly Muslim population in this Javanese region. A sultan is a kind of Islamic leader who holds both political and religious power. He maintained an enormous library at his palace with an impressive section on Javanese history, among other topics. Hamengkubuwono VII's reputation for generosity towards his people was well known. He sponsored massive traditional Javanese operatic/dance productions and parades, and he spent lavishly on the public arts, especially as components of major holiday celebrations. During this part of the late 19th century, and well into the 20th, the Dutch controlled Indonesia. They did so through a policy of indirect rule, administering its government through existing noble leaders, like Hamengkubuwono VII. Dutch colonial officials especially respected this leader and his family, admiring the tremendous size of his palace complex. They made sure that Hamengkubuwono and others in similar positions of nobility remained in positions of power, so that, working with the Dutch, they could retain the favor of the people. And the people of Blora evidently had a lot of reverence for their aristocratic elites, especially those who, like Hamengkubuwono VII, spent their wealth on the local populace. For example, Vickers describes some of Hamengkubuwono's morning rituals. In so doing, the tremendous prestige of power that the Sultan held amongst his people becomes abundantly clear. Every morning, a troop of servants came to bathe him, and then carried the water out to distribute to the populace as holy water that could cure illnesses and bring good fortune. So how's that for some practical leadership advice? Think about how efficient this practice would be for present-day bosses. This precious resource was going to be wasted, literally going down the drain. But now you can just bottle it up and give it out to your employees as holiday gifts, especially when you can't afford to give them raises or bonuses this year. Or just imagine how much illness-curing bathwater will save your organization in health insurance fees if you're working in a place without a national healthcare system like the United States. Everybody wins! On to the next lesson. Lesson number 2. Install a Unix system. Anyone looking for leadership success stories in history must at some point turn to one of the most important periods in all of Chinese history, the Ming Dynasty, which lasted from 1368 all the way to 1644. The Ming was founded by Hongwu Emperor, whose original name was, as pronounced by the Google Translate voice, Zhu Yuanzhang. His story is one of the greatest rags to riches stories in history. Or more precisely, one of the greatest rags to founder of one of the most powerful imperial dynasties on earth stories in history. Hongwu Emperor began as a peasant leader who rose up against the increasingly ineffective late Mongol Yuan dynasty, the government that had been established by Kublai Khan a century earlier. From the get-go, Hongwu Emperor ran his government on two major principles. First, he was an ambitious man who wanted to compensate for his low-born status as a peasant by establishing a long-lasting royal family, an imperial dynasty. Second, he feared conspiracies by other ambitious men who might try to plot against him and his government to create their own imperial dynasties. What's an emperor to do? Part of the answer is that he used incredible violence to deal with anyone suspected of plotting against him or associating with conspirators, real or imagined. The worst example came late in his reign when he started to anticipate a struggle for power after his death. The short version goes like this. Hongwu Emperor wanted his firstborn son to succeed him, but that son got sick and died in his mid-30s. So the emperor backed the firstborn son of his firstborn son, Hongwu's grandson, to be the next emperor. This grandson had a reputation of being a scholar and so commanded the loyalty of China's famous scholar bureaucrats, followers of the philosopher known in the West as Confucius, who had lived nearly 2,000 years earlier. But since the grandson was more of an intellectual than a warrior, his grandfather, the Hongwu Emperor, believed that he needed to clear the playing field of ambitious rivals for his chosen successor. So the Hongwu Emperor ordered the execution of 15,000 government officials and military commanders, who had themselves been loyal to the emperor, but who he thought might not back his grandson. Despite this incredibly bloody purge, the fourth son of the Hongwu Emperor, named Zhu Di, still wanted the throne for himself. After the Hongwu Emperor's death, Zhu Di raised an army to challenge his nephew. But he needed assistance in the imperial government to aid him. So Zhu Di turned to the other palace insiders, who he considered most loyal, the imperial eunuchs, men who had been castrated. In many parts of the world, eunuchs' reputation for loyalty came out of the belief that they were supposed to be without ambition. That reputation came in turn from the fact that they could not establish their own dynasties through their own biological children, because they were by definition sterile. Creating an official class of government eunuchs may be hard to understand in the present day, but it's important to realize that eunuchs played important roles in many societies all around the world. They were important in the Byzantine Empire, the state that sprung up from the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, and eunuchs were often utilized by Turkish rulers to guard women in royal harems. In Western Europe, the castrati were eunuch singers in Italy, whose voices had tremendous harmonic range as a result of having been castrated before puberty. Back in China, during many periods in history, eunuchs had not been educated. They were often forbidden from being schooled. They had served as guards and personal assistants, but not as thinkers or bureaucrats. In fact, both Hongwu Emperor and his grandson tried to limit the personal influence of the eunuchs. They forbade their education and kept them from leaving the palace, the Forbidden City. During Zhu Di's rebellion, though, a number of influential palace eunuchs escaped and gave Zhu Di valuable intel about the defenses of the imperial capital. Zhu Di conquered the city and became the new emperor, taking the title of Yongle Emperor. During his reign, he lifted the prohibition on educating eunuchs and, no longer trusting Confucian bureaucrats, promoted loyal eunuchs into positions of authority in the government and the military. Probably the most famous of the Yongle Emperor's eunuch confidants was the Admiral Zheng He, who lived from 1371 through the early mid-1430s. Simply put, Zheng He was one of the world's greatest explorers. He commanded what was called the Treasure Fleet from 1405 to 1433. This was an enormous fleet full of enormous sailing ships. The lead ship was 3 to 4 times larger than Columbus's Santa Maria. Zheng He's fleet traveled throughout the Indian Ocean and into the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula and Somalia in East Africa and the Swahili coast south to Madagascar. He and his fleet even spent time in and around the island of Java, close to 500 years prior to the reign of Hamengkubuwono VII. Zheng He is immortalized around the globe. In China, he's almost like the patron saint of all things seafaring and exploratory. There's a holiday in July that commemorates his first voyage. There are naval vessels and spacecraft and amusement park rides named after him. But the promoting of eunuchs also weakened the later Ming period. It led to infighting between elite eunuch leaders and elite non-eunuchs who had been educated in the prior Confucian system of government. Some historians claim that this ongoing conflict between government officials stifled the future development and expansion of the Ming dynasty. Yet for centuries of history, and in many parts of the globe, eunuchs played major roles as trusted servants and advisors. For that reason, their role in supporting leaders, and even their roles as leaders in their own rights, is worth remembering. That said, in the very unlikely case that you were wondering, no, the phenomenon of an official category of eunuchs in government definitely does not make sense outside of the original historic contexts in which the phenomenon emerged. And that brings us to our number one piece of leadership advice from the past. Lesson number 1. Magic statues. What's the very best way to demonstrate your leadership skills? Answer. Show your people that you have magical powers and/or that the gods are on your side. Both ancient Egyptians and ancient Greeks constructed so-called talking statues of gods. A statue would have a tube in it that ended at the mouth. Priests would speak from behind a wall into the tube, which would echo and amplify their voices, allowing them to speak in the booming voices of their undying deities. For example, a historian of ancient technology named Adrian Mayer reports in a 2018 book that archaeologists in Egypt discovered that the statue of one Egyptian god has a cavity in the back of the neck from which a narrow canal leads to an opening on the right jaw under the ear. The archaeologists speculate that a priest hiding under the statue spoke into the cavity and tube, which modified his voice to make it seem that the god delivered oracles. Dishonest? Perhaps. But was it the cruelest thing that a leader could do with a statue in order to justify their power? Oh no. Not even close. Mayer also talks about many other truly vicious uses of these same kinds of ancient technology. She relates, for instance, an account of a dictator named Phalaris who ruled an ancient Greek city in the early 500s BC on the island of Sicily. Phalaris allegedly was approached by an Athenian inventor who presented him with a large life-sized hollow bronze bull. The inventor showed the dictator that a hatch could be opened and that you could then trap a person inside the bull. He could then light a fire under it and roast the enemy alive. And meanwhile a system of tubes would acoustically amplify the screams of the poor cooking victim, making a horrible and terrifying display for the dictator's enemies, while smoke piped out of the bull's nose. Nasty stuff. A final twist to this story comes at the end. Phalaris supposedly asks this sadistic inventor to demonstrate the sound mechanism, asking him to crawl inside the bull, which he foolishly did. Phalaris then supposedly locked the doomed inventor in, started up a fire, and made a screaming, smoking human pot roast out of this bloodthirsty bull artist. Thankfully, much less cruel, but still certainly mean-spirited, was another animal-shaped statue, built 2 centuries later, for another tyrant in the Greek-speaking world. This dictator ruled over Athens after it was conquered by the Macedonians. He allegedly despised Athens and its traditions, and so reportedly had this giant snail built to humiliate the Athenians. Many of the specific details about this moving, mocking mega-mollusk have been lost, But what evidence there is indicates that it was probably run by one or two people inside it, who possibly worked some kind of a conveyor belt and steering mechanism that moved it along. It even included some way of dripping ooze after it, just like a real snail coasts along on a trail of mucus. The giant snail was pulled out of storage, presumably out of some kind of giant snail garage, once a year as part of an Athenian parade. Mayer explains that the point of the snail was to make fun of the slowness and stupidity of the Athenians. And she adds, the great snail itself was harmless, but it was a dramatic and public way for the tyrant to humiliate the Athenians, whose democracy was being crushed by Macedonians and their collaborators. So what advice can we pick up from this story about the colossal snail of shame? Let's glide on over to the conclusion and think about what we've learned here today. So what does history teach us about leadership? Let's summarize. First of all, cover yourself in weasels, and get shoes that are quadruply as pointy as the pointy kicks of the ordinary folk. And most important, prohibit anyone else from dressing the same as you. Next, make sure that you obey, but do not always comply with any orders that you happen to receive from anyone whose power is directly or indirectly derived from God. So sure, you're required to use your critical judgment in following orders, but never, ever, ever question the source of that judgment. And hey, don't forget to drain your bathtub into some kind of reservoir so that you can bottle it up for the benefit of all the little people around you. Apparently, the saying about not throwing out the baby with the bathwater is only half right. Looks like you shouldn't throw it either. Don't forget to surround yourself with loyal eunuchs. And never underestimate the power summed up in the acronym ABMMS. Always be making magical statues. Yes, display your power, inspire awe, and mesmerize your employees with the voices of the gods. Or maybe demoralize your rivals with a giant oozing snail. Or maybe, if someone tells you that the past is full of easy lessons for today's world, you might just want to take their advice with a grain of salt. For the most part, real historical researchers don't go digging for selective stories to turn into slogans, or motivational posters, or feel-good parables. Yes, there are plenty of lessons to be learned from the past, but the past is so much bigger than that. Past peoples were like us in so many fundamental ways, but they were also extraordinarily different, sometimes radically so. They had different values, made different kinds of decisions based on different underlying assumptions about how the world works. Only through immersing yourself in the careful, open-minded study of the past, trying to understand the way that past peoples thought and felt and dreamt in all its messiness, can we start to learn how rich and complicated and maddeningly confusing our predecessors were. In that sense, history is a lot like immersing oneself in a foreign culture. It offers different perspectives on life that you might not have even known you needed. For a simple example, it's hard to realize how strange it might seem to eat noodles with a fork until you live in a place where the locals use chopsticks. History offers the same kinds of insights. You never really understand how odd it may be for you to be allowed to wear more or less whatever you want, until you learn that in many past societies, sumptuary laws significantly restricted those choices. Or maybe you never understood how an occupying government can justify its rule, until you consider the impact of a giant mechanical snail designed to intimidate the Athenian population. Or maybe you never really think about how your own government is structured until you discover one where eunuch officials maintain order. History, once again, is big. It's bigger than any simple list of lessons make it out to be. It provides us with perspectives from people all over the world, over thousands of years. In the process, it reveals rich, complex, nuanced possibilities about the human experience that you might not have otherwise imagined. For next time, what do electric guitars, mass street protests, and 20th century authoritarian dictatorships have in common? The answer is Historical technologies for amplifying sound. You're too loud! Stay tuned. You may find the references to the historical sources and other information used for this and other episodes at findyourselfinhistory.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this and or other episodes and or about this podcast and or about podcasting and or history in general. Drop me an email at doug@findyourselfinhistory.com. In case you were wondering where in the world I do my professing, I work at Maryville College, incredibly close to the Great Smoky Mountains. Every day unexpected. Learn more at maryvillecollege.edu. Opinions expressed in this podcast are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect Maryville College, its administrators, faculty, staff, students, board of directors, or any fur-bearing weasels associated with this institution of higher education. This podcast episode was researched, written, edited, recorded, and mixed by Doug Sofer. All materials are copyright 2023 Doug Sofer. The theme song was also written and performed by Doug Sofer with Matt Trimbley on rhythm guitar. You can find more about Matt at trimbley.com. Thank you for listening.